Ladies and gentlemen, record geeks, retired plate spinners, and millennials who want to impress their parents with their record collections. Welcome to the Rhino Podcast, brought to you by Rhino Records. Get ready for new releases, deep tracks, and conversations with your favorite artists and bands, and balloons for the kiddies. And now, your hosts with the most, Rich Mahan and Dennis the Menace.
On today's episode of the Rhino Podcast, we have part 2 of our Replacements doubleheader with Dead Man's Pop producers Bob Mehr and Jason Jones speaking with Matt Wallace and Tony Berg, the original producers for Don't Tell a Soul.
Tonight we're gonna take a stab. Come on along, we'll grab a cab, 'cause we ain't much to look at, so close your eyes, here we go. Laying at the talent show. Laying at the talent show. There's a seat for you in the first row. Laying at the talent show. Come on along, here we go. See us at the talent show.
Hey, Rich.
Hey, Dennis.
Did you know that I can predict the future?
I did not know that.
I can predict what you will be doing in about 5 seconds.
What's that?
You will be looking at rhino.com.
It's true. Well, I'm on there quite a bit because I'm looking for the latest info to see what's going on in the world of Rhino music. Of course, the podcasts that we produce live there. There's the album of the day. There's artist playlists, including the new Duran Duran playlist that just posted. You can go check out. And you can find out all about upcoming Rhino releases, including the new Fleetwood Mac colored vinyl box set. Covers their albums from 75 to 1987. Every album is a different color, kind of cool. There's the Van Halen Japanese singles 7-inch red vinyl box set, which covers...
I want that. I'm looking
Dude,
at it
it's
right
so
now.
cool. It has all of the original Japanese artwork, everything during the David Lee Roth era that was released in Japan. Very cool. Grateful Dead, Ready or Not, is coming down the pike, and this is an album, a compilation of live performances of songs that would have been on the next Grateful Dead studio album. So, late era Garcia Hunter compositions. Deadheads are going to love this one. I know I will for sure. And of course, for you seasonal music aficionados, we have 2 new Christmas albums coming out. There's a new Christmas album from Chicago, aptly titled Christmas. And Los Lobos has their first ever Christmas album entitled Llegó Navidad. And it is awesome. Los Lobos fans, you're going to love this one. It sounds so cool. But Dennis, why don't you tell the folks what we have in store for them on this episode of the Rhino Podcast?
Well, part 2 of the Replacements Dead Man's Pop, which was basically the way to get the original Don't Tell a Soul out there in its original form with, and this is Rhino, of course, all sorts of extra goodies.
Yeah, you got to love it. Anytime there's a deluxe edition from Rhino, you know you're going to be getting all kinds of behind-the-scenes, unreleased material, and this set, Dead Man's Pop, is no exception.
It sounds amazing. The Matt Wallace mixes, the way the album was supposed to be, which if you listen to the Tommy Stinson episode, or you didn't, you have to hear how he talks about how that all went down.
Today's episode is really cool to listen to for you Matt's fans. You're going to get the inside history about the making of this record, why the band ended up not really liking it, and why a lot of fans think it didn't represent the band's kind of ethos, and what they did to correct it for this new release. Today, we have box set producers Bob Mehr and Rhino's Jason Jones, A&R, who produced Dead Man's Pop, which is this new deluxe edition, and they speak with Tony Berg and Matt Wallace, who were the original 2 producers of Don't Tell a Soul.
To quote a track, it is a major talent show.
They run down for us exactly what happened, tell some of these outrageous stories about, the Replacements' behavior in and out of the studio is notorious for a good reason, and we get all the fun stuff in this one for sure.
Without further ado, let's get into this deep discussion about Dead Man's Pop.
Dreams unfulfilled, graduate unskilled, beats picking cotton, waiting to be forgotten.
Hello and welcome to the Rhino Podcast. I'm Bob Mehr, author of Trouble Boys, The True Story of the Replacements, and I'm also the co-producer of the new Replacements box set from Rhino titled Dead Man's Pop. It's a 4-CD, 1-LP set which chronicles the Replacements' 1989 album Don't Tell a Soul and includes producer Matt Wallace's new mix of the record, a disc of rarities including the famed Bearsville sessions produced by Tony Berg, unreleased duets with Tom Waits, and a double live album, The Complete Incarcerated. I'm joined here today by my co-producer on Dead Man's Pop and Rhino's director of A&R, Jason Jones. Hey, Jason.
Hey.
So Jason and I spent much of this past year working on this project, and today we have convened something of a unique and historic summit, bringing together both of the producers who worked on this record with the Replacements. Joining us in the studio are Matt Wallace and Tony Berg. Matt, of course, produced the release record and was finally this year given a chance to mix Don't Tell a Soul, I guess about 31 years after the fact. In addition to his work with the Replacements and with Paul Westerberg as a solo artist, Matt has produced half a dozen albums for Faith No More, including their breakthrough, The Real Thing, and he's worked with everyone from Maroon 5 to John Hyatt to R.E.M. Tony is an esteemed musician, producer, and record executive. His resume includes projects by Michael Penn, Edie Brickell, Public Image, X, Squeeze, Andrew Bird, and Phoebe Bridgers, among others. At Geffen and Virgin, Tony was also instrumental in helping sign artists like Beck, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, and At the Drive-In. So I'm very happy to have Matt and Tony joining us. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
So as we kind of approach the idea of bringing these two producers together to talk about this, I sort of was sounding them out and having known both of them from working on the book. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to see if they both want to do this. And I don't even know, do they know each other? And it turns out they actually know each other pretty well because they're neighbors. So tell me a little bit, Tony.
Well, it would be much better drama if we were one another's nemesis. But as it turns out, we're actually quite good friends and we see each other every day because our studios are 20 feet apart from one
Yes, right
another.
across the parking lot. And in fact, Tony and I, we've known each other in the periphery, and obviously I knew him by name when he worked on the original version of Don't Tell a Soul. But actually, our deeper connection is a mutual friend, Josh Clayton Felt.
Yes.
And Tony had a wake at his house for Josh, and then, so we were kind of closer bonded on that. So, yeah.
Well, one of the things as I kind of look back through your resumes and your kind of personal histories, is there actually some similarities? You both actually started out as musicians before producing. I know, Matt, you were...
I'm a pretend musician, and Tony is a real musician.
but you came, you were starting, as a story goes, you were just started a little studio in your garage to record your own band and then sort of got sidetracked doing other people's bands.
I love hearing that. Yes.
And of course, Tony was a very esteemed musician and working as a guitarist and arranger for Jack Nietzsche, Bette Midler, many other folks. And then the other thing, looking at your resumes, is that the artists that I named is quite a range of artists, different genres and styles. Neither one of you are sort of specialists in a particular genre. You've always kind of done that. And I don't know if that comes from being musicians or being, having a song-based approach. So talk a little bit, I'm curious just to...
Well, I mean, I'll just, for myself, when I was 13, I was in bands and we were kind of doing like Black Sabbath stuff, and I was into really heavy stuff, but also my ear was really pulled into pop radio. And so while listening to Black Sabbath, I was also a big Carpenters fan. So I think I kind of bookend my discography between the brutal and the beautiful, because I worked with stuff that's really heavy and ugly and relatively unpleasant to listen to, and then there's stuff that's really melodic and pop. So that's kind of where I'm from. And as me being a musician, I think there's two people in the world. There's those who own instruments and those who can play them. I'm the former. I think Tony is the latter.
Tony, tell me a little bit, again, how you got involved. So this is early 1988, and you had made the transition to becoming a full-time producer from being a musician and arranger, and had worked with some baby bands, Broken Homes, and had gotten, Michael Penn, I think, even at that point already.
I'd gotten him a record deal.
Right.
And Bruce Hornsby and Eric Johnson. But I had just begun producing, and I got a strange phone call from a wonderful guy, Michael Hill, worked at Warner's A&R in New York. And he said, would you be interested in working with the Replacements? I said, oh, yes, I would. He said, well, maybe you and Paul should have a phone conversation and see where that leads. So we talked on the phone, and Paul said, why don't you send me a list of songs, artists, records that you think were unheralded, but that might have deserved much more credit. So I sent him a note, and I listed 10 things that were fairly obscure.
Do you remember what they are?
Boy, I don't, man. It's been too long. Yeah. But I sent the note, and at the bottom I wrote, look, I hope these resonate with you. I hope you like these. And if not, you can go fuck yourself. And, of course, I got a phone call about 12 hours later. Come to New York and meet the band. So I met in their office, the manager's offices in New York City. Gary and Russ were the managers. Yep. And the four guys were there. And we're talking. It's a bit of a blur. It was, I think, in the morning, and they were drinking beers at around 11. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I said something, I don't even remember what, but Paul reached over, pulled my shoe off, poured a beer in it, held it up, and said, "You're our man," and swigged the beer from my shoe. And
that's the replacement.
And so it began.
I don't know if this is correct that I saw after the fact. So they had played some shows in December of '87, and there's some photos of them with Ian McLagan and John Doe, and this would have been right after they had shaved their eyebrows. And I think you might have been backstage at that show.
Yes, but I didn't shave my eyebrows.
Right.
Good thinking.
But that would have been the first, maybe you crossed paths with them briefly.
Well, strangely, both guys, Ian was a close friend, and John continues to be. Right. So.
So you were, I think, at that time working with Charlie Sexton on a record in Bearsville and with Bob Clearmountain. So you were up there, and there was some this is now kind of May or thereabouts of '88, and I think they wanted to try and get the record done so that hopefully they could have it out in the fall, but as it turned out, it didn't come out to the following year. But so the decision was made one way or the other you had an opening, I think, and they said come up. They wanted to get started, I think.
Yes, what happened was, normally I'm a real stickler on pre-production and spending a lot of time with the artist. In this case, we were doing Charlie's album at Bearsville, and he was pulled away for 10 days. He had to go do something, and suddenly Russ was, we have to go. Come on, let's just use that time. And you can do it at Bearsville.
Right.
I said yes. Looking back, I realized I should have been better prepared. Right. I don't mean musically. I mean psychologically for what it would become. The maelstrom that was soon to arrive.
Had you heard any stories about them beforehand?
Yes. Yeah.
Also, the concept of being better prepared, I don't think that's possible. Honestly,
No, you're right.
I mean, I really don't.
Well, you were clearly better prepared than I.
Well, I think the thing that you kind of backstory or context for this is obviously there was a tremendous amount of pressure internally on the band to have a success. This was going to be their third major label record, their seventh overall. The band had been together 10 years, and they'd sort of constantly been sort of flirting with success. The previous record had done well, but kind of fallen short of expectations. And there was a sense, both I think externally within Warner Brothers and the management, but even more so internally, that the sort of clock was ticking, on the band and the dynamics of the band after 10 years. Any band, it's hard to be kind of on the verge for 10 years and never really break through. So I think there was a tremendous amount of that in the background, which probably nobody, was hard to be aware of maybe going in.
There were two things that were at play that affected me profoundly. One, I heard the songs.
Right.
And when I heard Aching to Be, Darling One, and I'll Be You, I knew I was being presented with just stunning material. And the second thing is, we all went out to dinner in New York one night. There were a number of us at the table, and someone at the table was picking on Tommy. And I watched Paul tear that person apart. And that person didn't even see what was happening. But I had so much respect for that because a band is a club.
Right.
And if they don't look out for one another, it can quite easily fragment and fall apart. And I just saw a real love for his bandmates.
Talk a little bit about going up to Bearsville. I mean, one of the things that the band points to as to why things ultimately fell apart is that the environment of Bearsville, these were city boys in the country to a great extent. So to set the scene a little bit, if you would have.
It was Green Acres.
Green Acres.
Well, it's a funny thing. It's this bucolic setting. Yes. It's an idyllic paradise. It's one of the great studios in the world, albeit not the kind of place they were used to.
All right.
And they had a barn in which you would live and rehearse before you went into the big room. And we got in, I think, 3 days of rehearsal. And I could tell there was something deeply amiss because I'm very prone to get deep into the songs and the arrangements. So Paul and I spent a lot of time talking about reharmonization and lyrics, and does this couplet stand up to the rest of the song, and what happened if we reinvert this chord, and it was wonderful. But I saw soon thereafter that was threatening to the band. I don't think they had experienced that before. So I didn't do a good job of integrating all 4 members into that process. Right. And I think I should have sensed that I should have been more inclusive in that process.
Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up and wonder where you are. Wake up and wonder where you are. Wake up and wonder why you wake up. Wake up, body fear.
I do remember 2 moments. One, on the song I'll Be You, there was a lyric where Paul sang, "I'll tell you what will we do." And I said, "That's intentional, right, Paul?" He said, "Oh, yes." Mm. I thought, boy, this is a real writer, fucking with syntax and the devices that a writer has at his disposal.
I purge my soul perhaps for the imminent collapse. Oh man, I'll tell you what will we do. You be me for a while and I'll be you. Oh yeah.
So when you get up there, you're working with the band. I think your idea was you were using some Sony kind of digital recorder.
Yes, we were. I had recently purchased what was then the brand new Sony digital multitrack, nice. 3324, I think. Yeah. And everything was going great, but our engineer was not that familiar with the machine. And you had to actually stripe the tape before you could use it. And we did an entire reels recording, and he hadn't striped it. So basically, we hadn't recorded for about an hour and a half of what we thought we were recording. That was a bad moment. And look, I was responsible. And things were, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like describing being mauled by a lion. It was just chaos. Right. But in the midst of all this, it was sounding, I thought, quite wonderful. Right. It would vacillate between exhilaration of getting a take that everyone was excited by, or my listening while we're tracking and hearing a racket going on during a song, and then seeing that Paul had completely smashed his guitar to bits while we were recording a song.
Right.
So that, coupled with their destroying the housing, the studio, the car, my right hand, and my left knee, it was my bar mitzvah each 1,000 years.
Talk a little bit, Tony, if you would, about actually recording. I mean, you were mostly recording live, essentially, right?
Yes. Portland was probably the most involved recording we did. Right. And I thought perhaps it was the superior song that he had played me. Right. It was a really interesting concept for a song, which is to say, it acknowledges that when you say you're going to do something, you are indebted to the people to whom you've made that promise. Right. And it's a song about doing it even though you're hating it. And that's borne out by the fact that as the song is fading out, Tommy is inexplicably playing bongos on this country song, which I loved. And as it's fading out, you just hear Paul say, "Portland, we're sorry."
Yeah. Bob, can you give a little bit of the context behind the story of the song Portland?
Yeah, the Replacements, Paul, one of the great things about him, I think like Ian Hunter or other writers in that kind of rock and roll milieu, he mythologized and self-mythologized the band, from the very first record, I Hate Music, where he talks about, I can't sing, Tommy can't, Bob can't play, all this sort of stuff. And then later they had a song that was originally, I believe, going to be titled The Ballad of the Replacements, which is called Treatment Bound, which is on Hootenanny. It talks about, just their sort of travails of being a band going, through these little cities in the upper Midwest and what happens. And in a sense, Portland is a kind of update of that, 7-8 years hence. And the testament to that is in the version that is on the box set, Dead Man's Pop. There we put a little rundown where they're kind of working it up and going through it. And as Paul is playing the chords to Portland, Tommy in the background is singing the first lines of Treatment Bound. So there's a sort of real connection there.
Little Easter egg for you guys out there.
Wonderful.
Tape. Share a cigarette for breakfast. Share an airplane ride for lunch. Sitting in between the posts and the rock.
As we get into kind of the session, so really, I think there's always been for many years kind of misnomer, like they made this complete record in Bearsville and it got shelved, which wasn't the case. It was just sort of a kind of pre-production and really elevated demos and kind of feeling things
Correct.
out.
It was a very strange process that was at once, I felt successful, but I was kind of finding my footing with them. I know that one of the two managers was extremely displeased with what he was hearing. And during the same period, the band had been contacted by Hal Wilner about doing a song for a Disney compilation called Stay Awake, I think. Mm-hmm. And we cut the song Cruella de Vil. Of course, Paul substituted some lyrics that were
Walt was not
bracing.
A little blue, bracing. A little blue, if you will. Yeah.
And we had to go to Minneapolis to recut that song.
Right.
Oh, really?
So we booked, I may be changing the chronology you'd like, but the story is an interesting one and up for debate as to the veracity. But we booked a couple of days at Paisley Park to recut Cruella de Vil. And before the session, we met at the bar that they always went to. I'm sure
the CC Club, yeah.
The CC Club. Quite a place. And we're sitting around talking, and it's feeling very edgy, the conversation. Anything I said was being met with contempt. And finally, I turned to Tommy, and I said, "Look, are you sabotaging this album?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you're too young to produce the Replacements." And I stood up and I said, "I'll see you later."
Right.
And that was the last time I saw them.
Well, and that sort of preceded, we should say, that was kind of the upshot of where the sessions ended. You'd done this 10 days in Bearsville.
With the intention of reconvening.
And as you hear on the box, you cut a lot of some different songs. There's actually a song on there that's previously unreleased called Last Thing in the World.
Featuring Tommy on bongos.
Tommy on
the very
bongos.
beginning.
Yeah, he had a real affinity.
But talk a little bit, I mean, it's taken on some myth and possibly some exaggeration as to how things went south. Again, obviously they were at a point internally, and being in the woods, I think after a while sort of got to them. I think in the liner notes, I quote you as saying it was my favorite thing. It was like producing pirates, you know.
Yeah, it was, and not the Pittsburgh Pirates. Yeah, it was. I think I just wasn't prepared,
Right.
And ultimately, I think they did the right thing.
Right.
I think it was a lesson for me in learning that an album is the artist's album. And it's important to accommodate that. That isn't to say that you just let everything run amok, but you have to recognize who the artist is and how you help that artist. And I just was a little green.
Don't you wanna fall just a little bit harder, harder? And don't you think there's things we shouldn't do? First thing that I did when I saw her, was the last thing in the world I shouldn't do.
So now on this box set, and the interesting thing about the Bearsville tracks, I think Jason will agree with me in this, there is a mix of things. You're hearing kind of, and I think one of the rare opportunities with Westerberg and with the replacements, you're hearing the songs evolve. There are sort of different tempos, different arrangements, still kind of working, evolving versions that you hear sort of then refined or changed. And that's such a rare peek into his creative process, to hear how something changes, or there's like straight acoustic version of like They're Blind, and you hear the
really raw versions.
Yes.
'Cause they're blind, they hold you too close to the light, and I see what they only might if they learn that you're starting to burn, but they're blind.
It's the arrangement of Rock and Roll Ghost is just Paul acoustic, Tommy on bass, and then an organ.
Yes.
Has a very like a Rolling Stone-ish vibe to it. And at the very end, you say to Paul, "That's a real performance," and he goes, "Thanks." But that's like it's a real magic moment where you hear praise, affirmation, and dismissal, like in about 3 seconds.
Nicely put.
No one here to raise a toast, so I drink to my little rock and roll ghost. Rock and roll ghost. Rock and roll ghost.
I had a real performance. It was great.
It's all good. Thanks.
You know, as Matt will attest, he almost didn't survive the experience either. It might have just
that's
been
nice to hear.
Oh my God.
So to transitioning to kind of Matt. So obviously things the record with Tony sort of didn't come together. So now it's the summer of '88. They start looking for producers. The idea of kind of getting it out in '88 is pretty well shot. Right. So they have to kind of start from scratch. And at this point, you know, they've gone through 2 records where they had gone through a lot of producers. The interesting thing, I think, at that time is the idea of the alternative rock or sort of indie rock major label type producer hadn't quite sort of come together. I mean, there was, at that point, alternative bands like the Replacements were either using sort of old classic rock guys, you know, the Sandy Pearlman's working with Dream Syndicate and Clash and so forth. And there was like, you know, folks like yourselves who were still very young at that time, you know, and budding in that world, you know, Scott Litt in that group. But there wasn't an obvious, you know, they were trying to get either Jimmy Miller to produce or, you know, that kinds of people, or going with young guys. In this case, with this record, it was sort of young guys. And I think the action sort of shifts also from the band being sort of very New York based, because Michael Hill was their A&R man for Warner Brothers via Sire. And then it kind of shifted. Lenny Waronker got involved, and which is how kind of Matt comes into the picture. At that point, you were, I guess, you'd done a bunch of projects for Slash. You were almost like a house producer for Slash at that time.
I had just, in 1988, the beginning of 1988, I moved to LA to be a staff producer and A&R person for Slash Records. And but prior to that, Roberta Peterson had hired me to produce this new Monkees track. And it was just a fluke because they were trying to revitalize the whole Monkees, you know, canon or that whole concept. And so I did this one track.
No, I've never heard the word canon.
New Monkees.
Because if you listen to some of that Monkees stuff, there's actually some incredible writing with
right.
Neil Diamond. There's some amazing, you know, under this guise of kind of a pop bubblegum band. There's actually some real songs there. So anyway, so I did this song, and it was kind of a fluke, and it ended up being the single. And here I'm this like outlier, and I produced the single, but I think somehow I became on the radar of Warner Brothers, and I think Lenny Worker worked with me. Roberta Pearson was my kind of a champion there, so that's how it kind of started. And that was actually the thing that kind of got me the Replacements gig, because up until that point in time, I'd done... The only thing I had of any impact was Faith No More's song called We Care a Lot, and that was the only thing I had going for me. So I think
awesome jam.
Thank you. But I think with
Killer.
the replacements, you have to either be super absolutely talented and have a tremendous track record, or be an absolute nobody. And at that point in time, I really was just kind of like a guy who wasn't really recognized.
But I think Lenny, in talking to him, he saw, I think, in you also somebody who could sort of... was a song person. I mean, Lenny's very song-based.
Yeah.
I think, in fact, Michael Hill, after the Bearsville sessions were over, he played some of the Bearsville stuff for Lenny, and that really is what brought Lenny to kind of being a kind of, rabbi figure for the Replacements in their A&R world, and that sort of is where you came in. Lenny really kind of brought you in, I think, in a sense, to that project.
And I used to say, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm working with these bands, because I came from kind of pop, even though I worked with Faith No More, but my underpinnings and foundation were pop. And I said, I don't know what I'm doing with these bands. He goes, you're the guy who can slightly bring them towards center. You can take these bands from the left, and with your influence, you can kind of bring them gently to this place. And I think that's kind of ultimately what happened. And by the way, the only reason I was even successful with this record is what you did, Tony. First of all, you really established kind of a path to go down. And I remember distinctly hearing your rough mixes when they were looking for other producers. And I had some friends that lived in Studio City. I used to walk up and down these streets with my cassette and my Walkman, listening to your rough mixes and trying to get myself kind of steeped in what you had established as a kind of a foundational and almost pivotal place for those guys.
So then you get this opportunity to work with them, and they're like with Tony, I think there was a call, right, where you had with Paul. That was the first sort of contact.
Yeah, so I'm working at Slash Records, and they set up this phone call with Paul Westerberg, and we talk, and he goes, I knew that the New Monkeys was kind of my entree into this thing, which didn't make any sense. And he goes, yeah, we like to drink a bit. And I said, well, I'm well aware. And by the way, I don't drink at all, so we'll get along famously. And I'd seen their shows. I'd seen them kind of just fall apart and just basically burn the stage down. And so, I just jumped on board. But I do think that you softened the landing pad. What's interesting is that they thought you were too young. Well, I was a few years younger than you. So, and so,
wait a minute.
But I mean, it was the kind of thing, because Slim had actually done that, where we one night we ended up going to the Rainbow after 3 days of recording and a lot of drinking, and he just pulls his face up against mine, and he goes, you don't know shit. Fuck you, you're too young for this record. And I finally said, fuck you. I just started, enough of this shit, But
Well,
it was,
didn't they took a marker?
Oh, yeah. So, we go to the Rainbow Room. We're sitting down, I think, because their whole idea is that you have to let down your guard.
Yeah.
So you really say what you think about each other.
Yeah, you get drunk and then the real version of yourself.
Yeah, so Wednesday night, it was our third day, and Bev Jones, our engineer, we all decide, okay, we'll go drink, because we're not going to drink while we're working. Yeah. And so we sit down, and they start drinking. Tommy takes this giant felt marker, puts it on my pant leg, and runs it up across my shirt and down across my pants. It was my favorite shirt. I kind of dressed up to go out, a little bit. And I was like, oh my God. So I started drawing on him, and it just became this thing just kind of falls apart, and Slim's literally threatening me in there, and he's got his face against mine, and I finally said, fuck you, I don't want to do this. And so the bartender, he's cleaning glasses going, you guys okay? I'm like, oh my God, So the next day, of course, Slim forgot everything. I guess I don't know if he blacked out, but he forgot, but he was nicer. And our engineer walked in 3 hours late, and I could see when he walked in by the look in his eye, he goes, I'm out. And so now I'm producing and engineering this train that's careening off a cliff. Anyway, so Slim and Paul came out first when we started working on They're Blind, and then Tommy and Slim, and Tommy and Chris come out later, and we go to Musso and Frank's. We're meeting each other. Michael Hill comes out. Let's meet each other. We're talking. Oh, this is really great. Getting to know the band. And as we're walking down, was it Hollywood Boulevard? Right, that's what it's on.
Yep.
And so, I hadn't really said much to Tommy at all, and we're walking down Hollywood Boulevard, and Tommy goes, what I think about you? I go, no. And he goes, and he just spits right in front of me on the street. I'm like, I go, okay, this is going to be...
This is before you actually started.
This is before we've actually done any work. Right. I just met them. And I was just like, oh my God, this is really going to be like wrestling with an alligator.
I'm back to back. Now how you gonna hold me back to back? How you gonna show me back to back? Baby, back to back.
So, Matt, you get in there, now the scene is sort of shift from upstate New York in the woods to sort of the heart of Hollywood. You're working at Cherokee primarily, doing the tracking, although you guys did end up doing some vocals at Capitol and then took the record back to Paisley Park where the story sort of brings us to Dead Man's Pop. But talk a little bit about working at Cherokee. So Tony was working kind of with a new sort of digital system, cutting live in a sort of foreign environment for them. This was maybe a little bit more sort of on
more
their
traditional analog. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't gotten to the approach where I would stand by the tape machine ready to record. And sometimes, if I was working with an engineer, they'd be frustrated because I would start recording before they got the snare sound or whatever. Right. And I just knew that if there was a moment you could kind of feel the band start to rise and fall. And so I would sit there and I'd hit record, and you can hear, like on Date to Church, you hear Paul go, "We should be rolling now." I was rolling 15 seconds before that because I was like, oh, I could sense it. And so what the trick of production with these guys was, you get a take and it didn't work, so you hit rewind, and you're hoping that you rewind in time before they start recording. And so I'd rewind and I'd hit and record, I'd wait, then I'd rewind again. So it was really, because those tapes are only good for 16 minutes.
Right.
And so I was always just in tune with when the moment they're going to hopefully get this thing. So I was on analog tape, and for better or for worse, I was just ready to kind of capture things.
Very smart.
Yeah,
Very smart.
And that was really it,
And you did try in the same way. I guess Tony had tried to do some rehearsals, pre-production rehearsals.
Yeah.
You guys started that way, but you found that wasn't.
Yeah, we went to SIR, and the only thing I remember about SIR, and this is unfortunately true, the only thing I remember about SIR is Paul going to the wastebasket to pee instead of going to the bathroom down the hall. And that was just like, but I mean, that was just like this thing. I mean, it's really like basically trying to keep marbles from rolling down a hill. You're just like, oh my God. And I think the thing is, if you're working with a singular artist with Paul, that's one thing. And you can kind of marshal your forces and try to be preemptive and capture it. But then you also have to have this, if Paul is Earth, Tommy is the moon. And that's really important to the tidal movement of this band. Right. And so there's that. But on top of that, you got Slim, who's new to the being part of the band, who becomes kind of this de facto bulldog protector of Paul, but at a point where he's really pushing outward and being aggressive.
Right.
Yes.
And so you're juggling these three guys, and then Chris was just like solid, and he played, and he didn't. He's the only guy who was never like unkind to me. And the other guys were there was always
unperturbed. Nothing really shook him.
Yeah. Well, and actually, in time. You said.
Yes. Because they used to accuse him of being, oh my God, Chris is like lagging. He's not playing with us. He's lagging. And you listen back and he's on time. And what I had to do, because I didn't have digital, all the guitars and all the bass were on top of the beat. And I would, after they would leave, I would take each guitar track singularly, run it through a Publison and set it back 20, 30, 40 milliseconds to put it in time. And same thing with the bass. And, and of course, Slim would be like, you mess with our guitars, I'm going to kick your ass. I was literally threatened consistently of having my ass kicked.
Sitting in a pew. Well, ain't we chosen few? Might not help, it can't hurt. All of a little day to church.
There is a point, I think, and talking to Michael Hill, who actually came out, I think, for the start of the sessions out here because he was now worried they've spent money, time has gone by, they want to get this record out. It's a very pivotal record. So I think he started out here, and I think the first couple of weeks was pretty rough, was the rougher patch for you. Yes. And, I remember asking Michael, he started to think when things were going south with Matt, it's like, is this just impossible, or are they unproducible? He was like sort of, there was no playbook to sort of deal with this stuff. What was it for you that, and of course, you went on to have a relationship with Paul. You cut his first solo record and remained friends with him and all that sort of stuff. What was, I guess, the thing that turned it, at least to a certain point, to where you could finish making the record? Right. As you say, that there was that first couple weeks, you were...
Oh, yeah. I was ready to quit every single day for the first 2 weeks. I'd go home to my girlfriend, Lisa, and I would just say, screw this. I'm just not going to do this. And I think what Tony had mentioned early on, the songs were so good, and Paul was such an essential, important American songwriter that I hung in there. But the pivotal moment really was because none of these guys drove. I used to pick them up in my 82 Honda Accord at the Hollywood Roosevelt and drive them to Cherokee and drive them back. And so one day, I think it was like a Friday. Oh, and I would drive them to pick up booze, and I apparently also got cocaine along the way, which I didn't know about. But I remember it was like the second Friday. I was driving them back, And I used to do the same where I do these handbrake turns with my car. I would like, turn the wheel and pull the handbrake and flip it around. And those guys were in the back seat, and I think Paul was in the front. And I was just tired of their shit. And we were coming up to a stoplight, and I actually gunned it, and I pulled the thing. And they like, what are you doing? They're grabbing the thing. What the fuck are you doing? I go, fuck you guys. I was just like, and I got to this point where I decided that I was going to make the record. Whether or not any of them survived it, I was going to make the record. When I got to that point, I knew I could do it.
You threw a scare into them because
I threw a scare into them, and I just and I remember talking to Michael Hilliard, and he said, we weren't certain you were going to be able to survive this thing, and I decided when that moment that I was going to outlast them.
Yeah.
Then I could make the record.
Well, also you proved to them that like. You were more dangerous than they were.
I did.
Like you're like a man is his most dangerous when he has nothing to lose.
At that point in time, but that's truly true because I'd been pushed so far,
and it was an opportunity for you. I mean, probably same as it was for you at that point, And so like you really wanted it, but then you're faced with this impossible thing. So it kind of the stakes were maybe more heightened than they would have been for somebody else who could just walk away from it and say, "I'll just make the next record with somebody."
But I was willing to lose the record at that point in time because I'd invested so much. I really wanted to make a great record, and I just was tired of their antics. And I also wanted them to know that, you know what, I will leave this.
Right.
I'm done with this. And I think, at some point in time, this is part of I think in your book, to illustrate these guys is that we'd make these recordings on analog, and I would cut to master reels, right? So I'd cut the actual 2-inch and have a master reel of 3 songs, another master reel. Well, their whole idea is that they don't want anybody to hear them at their worst, like when they're really drunk and they're sloppy. So they got all the outtakes, and they decided to bulk erase all the outtakes. So they did that, then they found out that you could actually listen to a little bit of track 12 and 13. So they had, Bozzy, our assistant engineer, they made him put him on the machine and arm all the tracks and wipe everything. Well, while they're deciding to do that, I literally, this is no exaggeration, I had a stack of 4 2-inch reels, and I sat on them while they grabbed all these outtakes, and they're running around. All 4 guys are running around, and they're erasing stuff, and I'm literally sitting them. There's a song called "We Know the Night" that we lost. We had a gorgeous version,
right, yeah.
A 24-track gorgeous version of "We Know the Night" that I thought could be on the record, and they wiped it. And
another lost classic.
That was a lost classic. Yeah. But because I was literally sitting on the reels while they're running around me, I mean, that was one of those moments like, I have to hang on to this record physically. And that was another moment.
You both get medals for this.
We don't know the crime ending rate, and we don't know the pain of a broken day. We don't know what's wrong or what's right. We know the night.
So when you get back to Paisley, back to Minneapolis, and I guess are doing some final overdubs on the record, what is your sense? I mean, have you kind of gotten what you wanted? You've nailed it, and you think we're there, and you're just... But and in a way, this record was a lot more you and Paul and Slim at the beginning and the end, kind of working on it. So talk a little bit about sort of where your head was at, sort of going into the finish.
I mean, for me, it was always just kind of I felt like a salmon swimming upstream. I was always struggling to corral and marshal their forces in making the best record ever. And I think that the thing that was kind of an indicator of what I was up against is that our first day at Paisley, they had a refurbished API, and they had just gone through all this trouble to recap it, make it just gorgeous. And so I'm not exaggerating. Our very first day, we're 10 minutes walking in, and Paul spills a tumbler of Jack Daniels across 16 channels of faders. And I mean, this is just like a microcosm of making this record. Where
and to which point, I believe in Bearsville, he was dancing on the console on the Neve.
I took out some channels there.
But that was really one of their kind of anthems. Was anytime we went to a studio, Paul would try to get up on the console. I go, "What are you going to do?" He goes, "I'm going to try to kick the knobs off this thing." I'm like, I mean, that was just how it was.
It's all true.
Yeah, it's all true. And so again, I'm trying to capture performances from these guys, trying to get the best vocals, the best guitar overdubs. And again, they would leave at 8:00, and I would spend time putting things in time in the most fundamentally challenging way, because I wasn't working in digital. I was having to run things with delay to put them in time. And again, every time Slim would leave and go, if you mess with our guitars, I'm going to kick your ass. And so I was doing that every step of the way.
Well, the rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting drunk. In a black and white picture, there's a lot of gray punk. Man,
so you're in Paisley Park. Time is winding down on the sessions. The record's basically done. In the background, going on the sort of machinations of the label and management, there was some thought, and probably not a wrong thought in terms of how do we get this record on the radio? How does this become a hit? So the management really and the label and the band ultimately acquiesced was let's give it to an outside mixer. Right. And it was the idea of having an indie producer work with a kind of professional mixer, which is what Nirvana eventually did in Breaking Nevermind. Now whether that was necessary, who knows? But that was the decision that was made at the time. And you were kind of aware that you were not going to get to sort of finish the record and mix the record.
Well, I'd hoped to, and that's why I did these rough mixes, but I made a mistake. And first of all, I rough mixed everything on a Sunday. I did the entire record in one day, which means I spent like 45 minutes per each song. I couldn't do any of the songs justice. Mainly it was a snapshot of where we were. In retrospect, I should have done 2 songs and nailed the mixes so I could have a shot at mixing this record because I was an unknown entity. Fast forward, after I finished the replacements, 2 weeks later, I did Faith No More's The Real Thing, which had Epic, and I proved myself as a mixer. But at that time, I was an unknown entity. And, of course, I did this rough mix, hoping I could do it. But, of course, fast forward, Chris Sordelji mixed it.
In the sweet Georgia breezes, safe, cool, and warm. And up and north, where we belong. On and on, beside you on. On and on, beside you on.
When Paul and I were talking while making the record, we were trying to make a timeless record. You couldn't tell if it was recorded in 1972 or 1992. We wanted to be not of an era, which it became that. And that was my frustration with the Chris mixes. And I had friends of mine who were musicians, and they actually blamed me for ruining the replacements. When they heard that record, they said, "You ruined the replacements." Like, dude, I tried to explain to him. And I think in retrospect, if I had more power or cachet, I would have said, listen, let me or somebody mix the album as an album, and then let Chris mix the singles.
No. You ruined it.
Well, with that kind of mythology, there was a precedent that was there because Jimmy Iovine did the mix of Can't Hardly Wait.
Can't Hardly Wait. Yeah, he had done
which was pushed to radio.
Which didn't sound that much different, but that was the idea.
It's got a little bit more snap to it.
Yes.
Matt finally got a chance to, earlier this year in May, go back to the tapes and mix them with kind of your original, the rough mixes or what you had in your mind back in '88 as a blueprint. And obviously we got the go-ahead from Paul and the band to sort of do this. And I think it's, one of those things that in the Replacements catalog, generally the Replacements did what they wanted and were happy with the results. This is one of those where, the circumstances kind of forced them or sort of pushed them to sort of hand off the record. And I think, again, while it did what it needed to at the time commercially, I think the overall reputation and it hasn't aged as well as maybe some of their other records. And I think this is kind of a way to correct that. And also, I think to put a lot more of the band back into the record as people have heard, of the tracks that have been previewed. And once they get their hands on it, it really sounds much more like a Replacements record. And in a way, you're hearing kind of, and particularly with the Bearsville stuff, you're hearing that evolution. So it's a really kind of, I think we're all kind of excited about that opportunity to kind of have that thing. So the one thing that was interesting, though, is we kind of made a decision when Matt was mixing, and we're kind of forced to by certain tapes situations to kind of mix the record as you had tracked it. So it's like, when you went to Paisley, because you guys ended up doing some additional overdubs and work while the record was being mixed. And so really this record is very much the record had you mixed it, in September, October of '88. And when you went back to the tapes, were there things that surprised you? Or, a lot of things you do on this, like you restore some live drums. There's, some tempos that had been sped up after the fact. So it's much more true to kind of what you guys recorded.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, some of the stuff had been sped up. I'll Be You, Lenny had recommended that we speed it up a little bit, so that's what happened in the mix. And then, what was it? They're Blind. They're Blind was really fascinating because it was a completely different tempo.
Right.
Where it was just like, oh my God, it had been sped up quite a bit during the mixing process, and I completely forgot about that. But also, back to your point, we had done additional recording while Chris was mixing. We had gone back to Cherokee and we were doing additional guitars and mellotron and stuff like that. Recut some vocals. Well, those B-reels were lost. Right. So those things were gone. So when I went to mix this stuff, I'm like, oh my God, all this stuff is missing. So the downside is that I had some things I would have liked to have incorporated, but the upside is that I actually mixed the album the way the band and I had intended. the one we turned into Warner Brothers before they said add this stuff and change the tempos. So it was really something. And I do want to say that part of my process for mixing was very discrete guitars, left and right, and bringing the background vocals in. And to me, I really tried to reinstate the charm and the melancholy of what the replacements are. As much bluster as they have, there's also moments of really quiet kind of sadness. And some of the things I brought in were some of Slim's background vocals that are so tentative and almost whispered. And that was really missing in Chris's mixes. And also, like Paul said, or that I took the goop of all the guitars. Chris had put a bunch of chorus on there because the guitars were a little sketchy in the tuning and things like that. So I just kind of put things back to where they were, and I try to incorporate more of their personalities and that kind of thing.
And I could purge my soul perhaps for the imminent collapse. Oh yeah, I'll tell you what we could do. You be me for a while, I'll be you.
The version of I'll Be You from the Bearsville session sounds more like Some Guys Have All the Luck by Rod Stewart than...
But in a really amazing way.
There's like some real synth flourishes that are there that totally sound like that. Yeah.
Well, guilty.
Guilty. As many of you know, this is kind of the culmination of a 30-year journey for Matt and for Tony, and we're very appreciative that they joined us. And of course, Dead Man's Pop is available from Rhino now, so we hope that you'll all kind of take from this conversation some interesting things, but really for everyone to go listen to the box set and listen to the work these guys did. So to Matt and to Tony, thanks for sticking with us for 3 decades and letting us pull you in here to discuss.
A great album by a great band.
Yes. Yeah, and thank you so much for this conversation today.
Thank you, too.
This is really great.
And I do want to say thank you, Bob, for being a real believer in the band. And you push, 3 or 4 years of behind-the-scenes work you did before this record got
Keeper of the Flame.
You really
Defender of the Faith.
And you really made
grayer of hair, as you can see. I've gone gray over.
But it was really, I just remember just you consistently every few months. Hey Matt, just hang in there. It's going to happen. And this went on for a couple of years.
Well, it's I may not be very smart, but I'm determined. So, so again, thank you to Tony Berg, Matt Wallace, Jason Jones. Dead Man's Pop is available now from Rhino Records. Hope you dig it.
Open to mouth, to speak. What comes out to mystery. Thought about, not understood. She's aching to be. I've been aching for a while now, friend. I've been aching hard for years.
Now that is what I call a deep dive into the original Don't Tell a Soul and the new box set Dead Man's Pop from the Replacements.
Yeah, we want to thank producers of Dead Man's Pop, Bob Mehr and Jason Jones, for hosting this one and getting original producers Matt Wallace and Tony Berg on board to tell the inside story of the recording of Don't Tell a Soul and how we got the new Matt Wallace mixes for Dead Man's Pop.
And if you're looking for an amazing nightstand book, Bob's book on the Replacements is a must-read.
Yeah, the title of that one is Trouble Boys, The True Story of the Replacements by Bob Mehr. Check that one out along with the new Dead Man's Pop. Thanks very much for tuning in. Don't forget to listen and subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss the next Rhino podcast. Executive producer for Rhino Entertainment, John Hughes. Produced for Rhino Entertainment by Pop Cult and Rich Mahan Promotions. All rights reserved.